Bueno, buenas tardes a todos y a todos. Vamos a dar comienzo entonces a la última actividad de este quinto Congreso de la Sociedad Chilena de Criminología. Si les pediré que por favor tomen asiento o reiterar un poco que se sienten. Bueno, quiero agradecer, digamos, que están presentes en la última jornada, el último momento. Así que bueno, sin más, voy a presentar a Frederick Cramp. Es Senior Lecturer y profesor asociado en Derecho. Es director del Cardiff Center for Crime, Law and Justice. Es Vice Chairman del Independent Scrutiny and Advisory Panel in respect of disproportionality within Criminal Justice Agency. Y ha hecho sus líneas de trabajo son fundamentalmente acerca del policiamiento, la práctica policial, procedural justice, legitimidad y etnografía reflexiva, ¿no? Así que voy a invitar a Fred como para que nos dé la charla y a continuación vamos a tener un ratito para un par de preguntas y después el cierre definitivo. Fred.
Buenas tardes. Just before I get into this presentation, I just wanted to just thank my hosts, Javier, obviously, Ignacio, who's not here, and Loretto, all of which have been very welcoming in terms of bringing me over to Chile to experience your approaches to criminology and so on, and also to experience the culture of the country itself. So it's been a wonderful experience so far. So I just wanted to give due credit to to those people for making me feel very welcome. So the presentation, I was asked to speak about some very recent research that I've done. And immediately what sprang to mind was this evaluation that I did for our Ministry of Justice. I'm not sure whether you have an equivalent ministry here, but in the UK it's a ministry which is responsible for criminal justice policy. And then the policy which comes from the Ministry of Justice has some implications for policing and so on, and also other criminal justice agencies. It's not direct, they don't tell them directly what to do, but they can issue guidance, guidelines, and the agencies will be expected to respond and implement various things. So in this instance, I'm going to be talking about something called integrated offender management. I'll introduce that properly and explain what it is shortly. The other thing I just want to say on this title slide is that this was a large, extensive evaluation, and it wasn't just conducted by me. It was also involved Professor Mike Maguire, Professor Martina Felser, and Janine Jackson as part of the research team. So I just want to give them their due credit as well. Anyone that's familiar with the UK criminology research will probably recognize the name of Mike Maguire and Martina, at least, very eminent and established criminologists in the UK. So it was a pleasure to work with them. So, as I was saying, we conducted this evaluation, a process evaluation, but what I'm going to do here is provide a kind of more academic overview of this evaluation of integrated offender management and summarize the findings, but beyond doing that, I'm going to cast a critical lens over what we found so that we might raise some questions of power, inequality, and social justice as applies. So the context, or what we would describe in the UK as the policy context, although I know that policy doesn't translate very well into into Spanish, sorry, but what we would what I would describe as the broader context, I'm just going to explain. So integrated offender management, it was launched in 2009. It stems from some legislation, 1998 Criminal Law Act, which basically told these agencies to work more closely together. The agencies being the police, probation, prisons, but also third sector organizations that are responsible for health, housing, and other kind of welfare-orientated approaches. So we wanted, the idea was that these agencies would work very, very closely together to manage various cohorts of people in the community that were what I would describe as prolific offenders, so recidivists, committing low-level crime like theft, breaking into cars, burglary, some robberies, yeah, but doing it repeatedly. And if you think about that, again, it would be very interesting to know what the comparison is in Chile, but certainly in the UK, people don't really wander about concerned about a murder, but they do worry about whether or not perhaps their car is going to be broken into, or whether or not their property is going to be stolen, or their house is going to be burgled. So you can see why it's extremely important to have some kind of approach when you've got people committing those sorts of crime and causing a lot of harm in the community. And it's often a very small number of individuals that are causing the harm, and just repeatedly. So that's what this was introduced to deal with. But it wasn't just an enforcement approach, it also took a social approach to deal with other criminogenic issues like health, housing, often drug addiction, but also welfare, employment, and so on. So in the outset, it showed, and I was actually involved in some of the initial evaluations of it back in 2010. And back then, it kind of showed early promise, and it was coherent, and it focused on the types of individuals that I've just described. However, over a period of time, there were several inspections that took place, and by 2020, it was decided essentially that the IOM as a concept had lost its way. And by that I mean that it essentially had fallen apart. The way in which it was supposed to work, it no longer operated in that way. So the primary issue was that it was a very muddled approach to which groups of people to target. So if you recall, I was talking about the initial targets of the scheme, the low-level recidivists, and it changed to dealing with things like domestic violence, serious organized crime. There was a branch that was dealing with army veterans, and so on and so on. And that was seen by the government as losing its way and not really what it was for. So the guidance changed. We had what was described as a refresh, so a reset of what the aims of IOM were, and a focus on neighborhood crime. So again, it comes down to what I was saying about, crime that concerns people in their day-to-day life. We would categorize that as neighborhood crime. But also, the approach itself kind of reflects a neoliberal responsibilization sort of process, where it's shifting responsibility away from enforcement and police, or that policing approach to help to push people into managing their own risks and fate through self-care and self-management and so on. So that obviously raises some questions, because in order to make those changes, those changes need to be supported by resources. So the third sector organization needs to have resources. And this was taking place within a context of austerity where resources were being cut. So that was problematic from the start. And also I would say that there's an issue of individual change having to come from within the person themselves. They need to want to change and they need to be participating in that change. So that's an important part of it. So just the methodology quickly. So it was a qualitative study. We interviewed stakeholders as a bit of a corporate term, but we interviewed police, probation, some other sort of hybrid probation workers, some service users, and we did this across 4 regions in the country. So it was an extensive study, attempting to capture an entire picture of what was happening with IOM after this refresh. However, there was a kind of imbalance between, and you'll see it actually made out on the next slide, in terms of who we got to speak to. So you'll see there that really there's an overrepresentation of views from management and staff as against the people and participants that are actually subject to the scheme itself. And for me, I feel like that's an important gap that should have been filled. I've done my own research separate to this on participant views of the scheme, but it seems, and again, I'd be very interested to know what the Chilean experience is, but often the individuals that are subject to these sorts of schemes don't have a voice or the social capital to be able to interact with what's happening to them. It just happens to them. So what we're doing here really is privileging institutional narratives over the lived experience of the participants, which I think is problematic. So the refresh brought in this new governance described as fixed, flex and free. I'll get to that shortly, and highlighted some new roles that would be needed to kind of provide the support. And as you can see from the quote on the slide, the police were very happy about this. They were saying a refresh had long needed to be done, and it was overdue. So by this, yes, the refresh, initially the thinking behind it gives us stronger oversight in terms of an approach that's losing its way. However, it also intensifies surveillance, monitoring and control. So you've got this immediate tension between, well, what are the aims of the scheme? Are the aims of the scheme to take a welfare-orientated approach to the criminality, or is it simply about control, monitoring and surveillance? So this is just a very brief slide on the cohort, the group of people subject to the new way in which targeting should take place. So if you recall, I was talking about it losing its way and targeting all kinds of different people. 3 categories were introduced, and basically guidance was given about how local regions should select participants. Fixed being the most intensive, flex down to professional judgment, and free down to local priorities. So you can see there's a lot of flexibility that the police and the other criminal justice agencies had in terms of who they would target. So there's still some questions there really about whether or not that sort of approach risks the inconsistency and mission drift that we had in the first place that generated the refresh itself. So it kind of, there's some questions around whether or not it undermines the entire shift in policy. So in terms of actually delivering IOM, engagement begins in prison, and the idea is that you get visits, the prisoners will get visits from probation and police to kind of try and attempt to build trust with the individual and make sure that the release and the support and the reintegration into the community is somewhat seamless. That's the idea. There's a brief quote there about, you know, the police saying, oh, well, we can help you not come back to prison and so on. So, and that, you know, that was taking place. The problem being that often young people, and particularly women, have very complex needs and often engage less due to structural barriers that are kind of in place. So just in terms of the delivery, you would expect, if you're on it as a recidivist, then you would expect 3 to 4 meetings a week with the police, with the probation service, and practical support would hopefully be offered. So it's very intensive, and it's, you know, the idea is that it can be a turning point for these individuals. But again, there's a kind of tension really about whether or not, you know, practitioners and the staff can provide this kind of welfare support in a broader context of austerity and cuts. So we've got a partnership going on, and with IOM, and this is actually a theme throughout the research in general, that the police and probation working together in this way has kind of generated a stronger partnership between the two agencies. But also there's a problem of the wider partnerships. They've become weaker, and that's really problematic in terms of the welfare approach, because obviously if you're interested in providing housing and helping with employment and also helping with mental health, for example, or drug addiction, then we need these broad partnerships in order to kind of help generate the change that we want from the individuals that are part of the scheme. So it can't just simply be about the policing, it must be about other institutions getting involved to help generate the change. So you can see there they're talking about look, housing isn't seen as a priority. Well, I'm sure housing is seen as a priority by somebody that would be on the scheme itself. Police saying, well, everyone needs therapy. And again, you know, so recognition of the problems that people have, but actually there's a real problem delivering it. So that was an unfortunate finding, really. And you know, the reflection there really is that that in itself reveals systemic inequalities due to the cuts, unfortunately, in budgets, basically. And again, I don't know what the context is here, but we do this a lot in the UK. We ask something of our criminal justice agencies, but at the same time cut the funding. So you've got to ask some questions as to whether or not there's coherence in that. So the structural underinvestment undermines the aims of the scheme itself. Also, in other research, didn't really come up in this because it wasn't the focus, but in other research that I've done, there's problems with police culture, ideas about whether or not people can actually change. And then there's relationships with participants, which becomes very important, both the present relationships and also the historical relationships that they have. So just some positives that came forth. Hold on. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so the positives, obviously, was that there were there was support for desistance. In other words, the breaking of the cycle of crime, the better relations between the police and other institutions, and sometimes offenders. But then there was some negative, obviously, gaps in housing and so on. So I'm just trying to. I think that. Yeah. Okay. So, sorry, somehow the slide's around the wrong way. But if you see there, it's a service user quote there, and he's saying, oh, well, you know, IOM helped him because he was treated as a person, perhaps rather than a statistic. And that also reflects the procedural justice in the quality of treatment of individuals and respecting humanity and treating people with respect in itself, which should but doesn't always lead to kind of legitimization of either the police or in this case IOM, and then that hopefully would then lead to some kind of law-abiding behavior, which would be the aims. Problem being here that desistance is framed narrowly as a successful outcome, whereas I would argue that actually that in itself ignores wider justice outcomes and general improvements that we'd like to see in the lives of people. So it's not just about somebody just stopping causing the harm that they're causing and us being satisfied with that. It's about how do we make that person's life better? How do we make that person's able to integrate back into society and so on, and have a positive and good, life, as it were. So the chart that I've got there, if you just reflects basically what I've been saying. So the red of the blue obviously being positive, the red where there's gaps. So you can see that desistance support is positive, police relations is positive, the monitoring effect, well, there's a lot going on there. I'm not quite sure whether that fits into a positive or a negative, really. It depends how you frame the scheme. But you can see, again, due to the cuts in funding, we've got massive gaps in housing and services. So that's really problematic, I think. The cohort themselves are often permeated with these personal problems which have to be tackled in order to kind of break this cycle. So really, really difficult there if you've got a lack of funding. So just briefly, I don't know how long I've been talking for, but just sort of coming towards the end, really. So we've got here just some kind of key critical points which came out of it. So the evaluation reveals that there's the potential for kind of net winding in terms of who is going to be caught up in the scheme. So there's a danger of marginalised groups, racialised groups becoming the targets and being over-policed. There's also a problem with a focus on metrics, okay, so desistance, so numbers of people that stop, reductions in crime, statistics and so on, over the lived experience of participants and essentially trying to make their lives better. That's another problem. So we might argue, certainly I would argue that it's one way of criminalising poverty, and also there's this tension between rehabilitative approaches, welfare support or orientated approaches, and punitive approaches, which include surveillance, monitoring and control. And interestingly, one of the, several of the probation staff talked about the problem of bureaucracy, which is something I'm pretty sure you're familiar with here in Chile. And she was saying, this is just a quote from one of them, but the general theme was that they were now at risk of being dominated by this bureaucracy and not actually being able to kind of precipitate the change that they wanted to. So just some quick reflections, really. No. Yeah, sorry. So the recommendations that we made from the report were funding. Obviously, money is needed. What was really important, interestingly, was that these organisations were co-located in particular offices, so that really helped with the culture, to change the culture, and it also helped to generate better relations between the agencies, better relations between the agencies and the individuals that were subject to the scheme. And also, we were advocating for early for training for individuals, but also this early intervention. It's really important that there isn't a gap between somebody leaving custody and then somebody you know, attempting to return to society. So we've got this shift really from what was an initial narrow kind of risk management approach to what we want is a broader, I would argue, a broader social justice orientation in relation to these sorts of schemes, with a real need to properly fund and properly accept and advance the social justice aspects of it, so housing, welfare, mental health, problems with substance misuse, to enable genuine desistance, not simply statistical desistance, but desistance where people's lives are actually properly turned round and they have an opportunity to reintegrate into society where they can obviously become useful members of the of society itself. I always find it odd that there's a sense that we should just, once someone stopped their criminality, that should be the end of our role in their lives. It's not necessarily as simple as that. And there's some other questions around how we actually define desistance itself. Is that an immediate thing? Is it over months? Is it over years or so on? So that's a question. But it certainly needs the support of some of these agencies. And that's all I've got to say about it, really. I hope that, I don't know how long that's taken, but that's what I've got to say. I hope that it's been interesting at some level. A question I was asked initially, and a question that I'm often asked, is whether or not this is transferable into other transnational policing approaches. So, for example, Chilean, US, or Canada. Interestingly, they do something like this in the US, to be fair, but I think that's a bit of an open question, so that would be something interesting to have a debate about. But yeah, that's it, and I've got open for any questions that people have.
Hola, hola. Tenemos espacio para preguntas, entonces vamos a hacer lo siguiente. Si quieren hacer la pregunta en español, la pueden hacer en español, yo se la traduzco, o la pueden hacer en inglés con el micrófono. Así que si alguien levanta la mano y quiere hacer una pregunta, yo voy a ir hasta su asiento. Ya, tú la haces en inglés.
Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation. I have a few questions, but feel free not to answer all of them if it's too much. I'm sorry. So the first one is about, you were talking about neoliberal responsabilization, and I've been also reflecting around it, working in the case of community policing approach in Chile. So I was looking into this initiative called Plan Cuadrante, and I was also thinking about and reflecting around the idea of responsabilization, because it's framed in this idea of the co-production of security. But I've been only looking at discourses, so more focused on language. I wanted to know if you have any more insights on how this can be also identifying practices. And also the second question.
Can I answer that question first?
Oh, yeah.
Is that okay? Yeah. Because otherwise I'll end up forgetting what you said. It was quite a complex question. So I just wanted to understand, just very briefly, what it was that you were saying initially about the approach and also trying to reveal and unfold what the actual dimensions of it work. Is that what you were saying? I maybe missed a little bit.
So how do you identify practices of responsabilization? Because I've only reflect around the vocabulary and more in discourses.
Okay, right. So yeah, in terms of methodology, then identifying the practice. Well, I suppose in this evaluation, the way we were able to identify the practices was asking people what they were doing, and also obviously unfolding statistics. But I personally don't think that's a particularly useful way of gaining an entire picture of what's actually happening. but that was the constraints of the government methodology that they wanted us to use. My own research uses ethnography as an approach, because my own view is that words can help us understand something, but actually it's actions that really matter. So if we see people in action, we're much more likely to understand what it is that's actually happening, which responds to your second point, I think, about whether we can identify specific aspects of it that seem to be working in practice, and that's much better done with an ethnographic approach. I'm hoping that dealt with that question. I'd be pleased to hear another.
Yeah, thank you. Do I do the second one, or do you want to democratize the microphone?
¿Dónde? Ya, vamos a dar una más y alguien más. Tomamos dos más y después vamos al cierre. ¿O solamente una? Una, ya.
Hola, soy Diego, soy estudiante de Antropología Social y me llamó mucho la atención que mencionara justamente la relación entre etnografía y en este caso seguridad. Y la pregunta bien concreta es cómo podemos profundizar la relación entre los métodos antropológicos con la seguridad pública, idealmente con la construcción de una seguridad comunitaria.
¿Entre el método etnográfico y la seguridad comunitaria? Yeah, okay. Sorry, he wants to know how you can improve the relationship between ethnography and the community safety. Public safety. I think he referred to community policing, sorry.
Sorry, are you saying how you can improve relations between the criminal justice agencies and third sector?
He's wondering the relationship between ethnographic risk methods
Yes.
and policing community.
Not sure I follow that question. What I would... Well, it's a methodology question, that. So is it a question as to whether or not that the methodology of ethnography is useful in that sense, or is it... because my argument, obviously, is that it is.
Yeah, okay. So I want to know which is how ethnography could actually improve public safety, or the safety studies.
Okay, right, yeah, I think I understand it. So it goes back, it partly responds to the first question that I had, that we actually need to understand more than the words that people say, but the actions that they actually take. So ethnography and how that can improve practice is that we get a much greater understanding, obviously, of the actions that people take day to day during the practice of carrying out this approach. So again, I would return to other research that I've done where I've spent extensive time, months, 18 months actually, in one of these units, attempting to understand through observation what's happening, and also seeing firsthand how change is possible and the development of relationships. And I think in that way, I'm not sure there's a direct relationship between ethnographic approaches and improvement, but there's certainly a relationship between ethnographic approaches to this research and having a better understanding. And then if the agencies are prepared to base their practice on evidence, then therein is the potential for change on the basis of methodology. So it's about whether or not the police, probation service and so on will use what we would describe in the UK as evidence-based practice. And there's some tension around that, certainly in the UK. It's a very controversial issue, actually, as to whether or not the police will respond to academic evidence, despite the fact the Ministry of Justice asking us to do this evaluation in this way. So there's definitely a tension there.
Bueno, agradecemos entonces a nuestro expositor en la jornada de cierre del 5º Congreso Internacional de la SOCHICRIM, a Frederick, y para darle el agradecimiento por estar en esta actividad, lo invitamos a que se quede aquí en el escenario con nosotros, porque Javier Velázquez, profesor de la Universidad de O'Higgins y miembro de la directiva de SOCHICRIM, le va a entregar un presente. Así que, por favor. Por acá. Muchas gracias. Javier, otra foto. ¿Otra foto más cerquita? Muchas gracias. Ya, aplausos. Bueno, y para ir finalizando este 5º Congreso Internacional de la Sociedad Chilena de Criminología, vamos a dejar acá con las palabras a la institución organizadora de esta actividad, que fue la Universidad de Valparaíso, y va a estar representada por la profesora de la Escuela de Derecho de la Universidad de Valparaíso, Marcela Aedo, y el profesor de la Escuela de Sociología, Diego Piñol, a quienes invito a pasar adelante.
Muy buenas tardes. En este cierre queremos agradecer a todos y todas las asistentes y participantes que sabemos que han venido de todo nuestro país y también del extranjero. Agradecer por su participación, por su compromiso, por el interés y por su entusiasmo. A nivel institucional también nos gustaría dar las gracias a las escuelas de Derecho y de Sociología de la Universidad de Valparaíso, particularmente al Centro de Investigaciones de Filosofía del Derecho y Derecho Penal de la Universidad de Valparaíso, dar las gracias a su director, Luis Villavicencio, sin cuyo aporte no hubiese sido posible realizar este congreso. En ese sentido, también agradecer al Banco Interamericano de Desarrollo, especialmente a través de la persona de Lina Marmolejo, también al Núcleo de Complejidad Criminal, especialmente dar las gracias a su directora, Catalina Droppelman, a Hulda Figueroa y Romina Ramos, que nos han acompañado. Disculpen si se me va algún nombre. Y en particular a todo el equipo directivo de SOCHICRIM, sin cuya presencia y colaboración no hubiese sido posible sacar adelante este espacio.
Bien, muchas gracias, Marcela. Yo, para finalizar, solamente quiero pedirles un aplauso para Marcela Edo, Rocío Sánchez y todo el equipo de la Facultad de Derecho que se han dedicado todos estos meses a poder organizar esta actividad. Así que partamos primero por ese aplauso, por favor. Les voy a pedir un segundo aplauso y les voy a gastar todas sus manos y lo voy a dejar con llagas. Para todos los ponentes que han querido compartir su conocimiento con nosotros, a todos los moderadores que gentilmente nos han apoyado en la organización de este congreso, un segundo aplauso para ellos también, por favor. Y como último gran aplauso y ojalá ovación, agradecer a todos los ayudantes de estudiantes de Sociología, de Derecho, que han dedicado y han puesto lo mejor de sí para que estos 3 días puedan estar ustedes lo más cómodo posibles en esta actividad y que han dado no solamente su mejor energía, sino su mejor profesionalismo en este trabajo. Por favor, un último aplauso. Gracias.
Bueno, muchas gracias a Diego Piñol y a Marcela Edo, docentes de las escuelas de Sociología y Derecho, respectivamente, de la Universidad del Paraíso, en sus palabras de cierre de la actividad. Y para finalizar, vamos a invitar adelante a Claudio González, presidente de la Sociedad Chilena de Criminología, quien va a dar las palabras de cierre y reflexiones finales de esta actividad a nombre de la directiva de la SOCHICRIM.
Bueno, muchas gracias. Había escrito algo, pero en realidad son breves apuntes. Bueno, primero que nada, muchas gracias en términos individuales a Diego, Marcela, Rocío, pero también al profesor Guzmán Dálvora, que no está presente hoy día, pero el profesor Guzmán Dálvora fue, de hecho, la primera conversación. Este congreso ha sido increíble. La gente de Valparaíso, tanto sociología como derecho, se hicieron cargo de un congreso que inicialmente no era acá, hay que decirlo. Por tanto, la cantidad de meses era muy complejo montar este congreso. Entonces, yo creo que ese es un atributo que quizás no todo el mundo lo conoce, pero ha sido increíble. Evidentemente, dar un agradecimiento a todos los asistentes nacionales, extranjeros, a todos los estudiantes, los alumnos, los profesionales, la sociedad civil, etcétera. Moderadores, se me olvidan toda la enorme cantidad de tipologías que colaboran en un congreso. Ha sido impresionante. Este congreso, la verdad, que marca un hito. Es nuestro tercer congreso presencial. Superamos ya a los online, que ya era importante. Pero además, este congreso, cierto, como hace una hora y media atrás, tuvimos nuestra primera asamblea de la Sociedad Chilena de Criminología, con no estaban los 77 miembros de la sociedad, pero es un hito súper relevante. La verdad es que este congreso también marca un hito por la temática que asumimos. Esperamos que este congreso, para los tiempos que vivimos y los periodos electorales, donde con muchos discursos respecto también de odio, de irracionalidades, de una clase política también distanciada de la ciencia o con las ganas de instrumentalizar la ciencia. Nuestro pequeño aporte como Sociedad Chilena de Criminología es justamente otorgar algún poquito de racionalidad en nuestro oficio de académicos, investigadores o futuros académicos e investigadores en el campo de la criminología. Sabemos que la criminología es una superárea, es una familia muy amplia, con muchas aproximaciones epistemológicas, mucha metodología, muchos sesgos. Hemos sido conscientes también de todos nuestros sesgos que tenemos en cada una de nuestras investigaciones y por tanto yo creo que debemos estar orgullosos de lo que hemos conseguido. Probablemente nuestra sociedad, que además no es común en Latinoamérica, se ha formalizado de un modo increíble. Y bueno, no quiero extenderme más porque estamos todos cansados. Y nada, pues solo quería contarles de que el Congreso sigue, no este Congreso, no sé eso. Sigue el Congreso el próximo año en otro lugar del país. Ha habido ofrecimiento de diversas universidades respecto a este Congreso. Teníamos una norma no escrita, hasta los estatutos, una norma de la directiva, que era intercalar Santiago con regiones. Pero como buenos criminólogos, ¿cierto? Hemos torcido la norma, así que ha sido nuestra transgresión inicial, pero además por un tema de realismo, porque es posible que las regiones logren atrapar, ¿cierto? También otra metáfora, logren atrapar a la gente que concurre. Así que nada, el próximo congreso ya se presentó, iba a decir una palabra clave, ¿o no? Así que bueno, ahí está el próximo congreso, se va a la Universidad de Talca y la sede es la ciudad de Talca. Así que le quiero dar las gracias al profesor Raúl Carnevale, que no está, y a Gloria Mancilla, cierto que en el simulacro los logré convencer respecto de la posibilidad de realizar el Congreso en Talca, porque inicialmente iba a ser el 27, pero que se adelante para el próximo año. Así que no hay fecha todavía, hay sede, no hay todavía tampoco temática, habrá que buscar la temática con la Universidad de Talca. Y nada, los esperamos para el próximo año, así que muchas gracias por asistir y nada, y bueno, el tema del vino de honor me dicen, pero no sé si todos los años también hacemos una foto de grupo, no sé, será acá arriba. Así que los invito a subir al escenario, algunos ya han estado, pero así que bueno, muchas gracias.